a venerable family mansion, in a highly picturesque state of semi-dilapidation, pleasantly situated on a strip of dry land between the sea and the fens, at the verge of the county of Lincoln, had the honor to be the seat of Christopher Glowry, Esquire. This gentleman was naturally of an atrabilarious temperament, and much troubled with those phantoms of indigestion which are commonly called blue devils. He had been deceived in an early friendship, he had been crossed in love, and had offered his hand from pique to a lady, who accepted it from interest, and who, in so doing, violently tore asunder the bonds of a tried and youthful attachment. Her vanity was gratified by being the mistress of a very extensive, if not very lively, establishment, but all the springs of her sympathies were frozen. Riches she possessed, but that which enriches them, the participation of affection, was wanting. All that they could purchase for her became indifferent to her, because that which they could not purchase, and which was more valuable than themselves, she had, for their sake, thrown away. She discovered, when it was too late, that she had mistaken the means for the end, that riches, rightly used, are instruments of happiness, but are not in themselves happiness. In this wilful blight of her affections, she found them valueless as means. They had been the end to which she had immolated all her affections, and were now the only end that remained to her. She did not confess this to herself as a principle of action, but it operated through the medium of unconscious self-deception, and terminated in inveterate avarice. She laid on external things the blame of her mind's internal disorder, and thus became by degrees an accomplished scold. She often went her daily rounds through a series of deserted apartments, every creature in the house vanishing at the creak of her shoe, much more at the sound of her voice, to which the nature of things affords no simile, for as far as the voice of woman, when attuned by gentleness and love, transcends all other sounds in harmony, so far does it surpass all others in discord, when stretched into unnatural shrillness by anger and impatience. Mr. Glowry used to say that his house was no better than a spacious kennel, for every one in it led the life of a dog. Disappointed both in love and in friendship, and looking upon human learning as vanity, he had come to a conclusion that there was but one good thing in the world, videlicet, a good dinner, and this his parsimonious lady seldom suffered him to enjoy. But one morning, like Sir Leoline in Christabel, he woke and found his lady dead, and remained a very consolate widower with one small child. This only son and heir Mr. Glowry had christened Scythrop, from the name of a maternal ancestor, who had hanged himself one rainy day in a fit of tedium vitae, and had been eulogized by a coroner's jury in the comprehensive phrase of fais l'Odyssée, on which account Mr. Glowry held his memory in high honor, and made a punch-bowl of his skull. When Scythrop grew up, he was sent, as usual, to a public school, where a little learning was painfully beaten into him, and from thence to the university, where it was carefully taken out of him, and he was sent home like a well-threshed ear of corn, with nothing in his head, having finished his education to the high satisfaction of the master and fellows of his college, who had, in testimony of their approbation, presented him with a silver fish-slice, on which his name figured at the head of a laudatory inscription in some semi-barbarous dialect of Anglo-Saxonized Latin. His fellow students, however, who drove tandem and random in great perfection, and were connoisseurs in good inns, had taught him to drink deep ere he departed. He had passed much of his time with these choice spirits, and had seen the rays of the midnight lamp tremble on many a lengthening file of empty bottles. He passed his vacations sometimes at Nightmare Abbey, sometimes in London, at the house of his uncle, Mr. Hilary, a very cheerful and elastic gentleman who had married the sister of the melancholy Mr. Glowry. The company that frequented his house was the gayest of the gay. Scythrop danced with the ladies and drank with the gentlemen, and was pronounced by both a very accomplished, charming fellow, and an honor to the university. At the house of Mr. Hilary, Scythrop first saw the beautiful Miss Emily Girouette. He fell in love, which is nothing new. He was favorably received, which is nothing strange. Mr. Glowry and Mr. Girouette had a meeting on the occasion, and quarrelled about the terms of the bargain, which is neither new nor strange. The lovers were torn asunder, weeping and vowing everlasting constancy, and in 3 weeks after this tragical event, the lady was led a smiling bride to the altar by the Honourable Mr. Lackwit, which is neither strange nor new. Scythrop received this intelligence at Nightmare Abbey, and was half distracted on the occasion. It was his first disappointment, and preyed deeply on his sensitive spirit. His father, to comfort him, read him a commentary on Ecclesiastes, which he had himself composed, and which demonstrated incontrovertibly that all is vanity. He insisted particularly on the text, "One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman amongst all those have I not found." "How could he expect it," said Scythrop, "when the whole 1,000 were locked up in his seraglio? His experience is no precedent for a free state of society like that in which we live." "Locked up or at large," said Mr. Glowry, "the result is the same. Their minds are always locked up, and vanity and interest keep the key. I speak feelingly, Scythrop." "I am sorry for it, sir," said Scythrop. "But how is it that their minds are locked up? The fault is in their artificial education, which studiously models them into mere musical dolls, to be set out for sale in the great toy shop of society." "To be sure," said Mr. Glowry, "their education is not so well finished as yours has been, and your idea of a musical doll is good. I bought one myself, but it was confoundedly out of tune. But whatever be the cause, Scythrop, the effect is certainly this, that one is pretty nearly as good as another, as far as any judgment can be formed of them before marriage. It is only after marriage that they show their true qualities, as I know by bitter experience. Marriage is, therefore, a lottery, and the less choice and selection a man bestows on his ticket, the better. For if he has incurred considerable pains and expense to obtain a lucky number, and his lucky number proves a blank, he experiences not a simple but a complicated disappointment, the loss of labor and money being superadded to the disappointment of drawing a blank, which, constituting simply and entirely the grievance of him who has chosen his ticket at random, is, from its simplicity, the more endurable. This very excellent reasoning was thrown away upon Scythrop, who retired to his tower as dismal and disconsolate as before. The tower which Scythrop inhabited stood at the southeastern angle of the abbey, and on the southern side the foot of the tower opened on a terrace, which was called the garden, though nothing grew on it but ivy and a few amphibious weeds. The southwestern tower, which was ruinous and full of owls, might with equal propriety have been called the aviary. This terrace or garden, or terrace garden, or garden terrace, the reader may name it ad libitum, took in an oblique view of the open sea, and fronted a long tract of level sea-coast, and a fine monotony of fens and windmills. The reader will judge, from what we have said, that this building was a sort of castellated abbey, and it will probably occur to him to inquire if it had been one of the strongholds of the ancient church militant. Whether this was the case, or how far it had been indebted to the taste of Mr. Glowry's ancestors for any transmutations from its original state, are, unfortunately, circumstances not within the pale of our knowledge. The northwestern tower contained the apartments of Mr. Glowry. The moat at its base, and the fens beyond, comprised the whole of his prospect. This moat surrounded the abbey, and was in immediate contact with the walls on every side but the south. The northeastern tower was appropriated to the domestics, whom Mr. Glowry always chose by one of two criterions, a long face or a dismal name. His butler was Raven, his steward was Crow, his valet was Skellet. Mr. Glowry maintained that the valet was of French extraction, and that his name was Squelette. His grooms were Maddox and Graves. On one occasion, being in want of a footman, he received a letter from a person signing himself Diggory Deathshead, and lost no time in securing this acquisition. But on Diggory's arrival, Mr. Glowry was horror-struck by the sight of a round, ruddy face and a pair of laughing eyes. Deathshead was always grinning, not a ghastly smile, but the grin of a comic mask, and disturbed the echoes of the hall with so much unhallowed laughter that Mr. Glowry gave him his discharge. Diggory, however, had stayed long enough to make conquests of all the old gentleman's maids, and left him a flourishing colony of young Deathsheads to join chorus with the owls that had before been the exclusive choristers of Nightmare Abbey. The main body of the building was divided into rooms of state, spacious apartments for feasting, and numerous bedrooms for visitors, who, however, were few and far between. Family interests compelled Mr. Glowry to receive occasional visits from Mr. and Mrs. Hilary, who paid them from the same motive, and as the lively gentleman on these occasions found few conductors for his exuberant gaiety, he became like a double-charged electric jar, which often exploded in some burst of outrageous merriment to the signal discomposure of Mr. Glowry's nerves. Another occasional visitor, much more to Mr. Glowry's taste, was Mr. Flosky. Footnote: Mr. Flosky is a corruption of Philosky, meaning a lover or sectator of shadows. End of footnote. A very lachrymose and morbid gentleman, of some note in the literary world, but in his own estimation of much more merit than name. The part of his character which recommended him to Mr. Glowry was his very fine sense of the grim and the tearful. Nobody could relate a dismal story with so many minutiae of supererogatory wretchedness. No one could call up a raw head and bloody bones with so many adjuncts and circumstances of ghastliness. Mystery was his mental element. He lived in the midst of that visionary world in which nothing is but what is not. He dreamed with his eyes open, and saw ghosts dancing around him at noontide. He had been in his youth an enthusiast for liberty, and had hailed the dawn of the French Revolution as the promise of a day that was to banish war and slavery, and every form of vice and misery from the face of the earth. Because all this was not done, he deduced that nothing was done, and from this deduction, according to his system of logic, he drew a conclusion that worse than nothing was done, that the overthrow of the feudal fortresses of tyranny and superstition was the greatest calamity that had ever befallen mankind, and that their only hope now was to rake the rubbish together and rebuild it without any of those loopholes by which the light had originally crept in. To qualify himself for a coadjutor in this laudable task, he plunged into the central opacity of Kantian metaphysics, and lay perdu several years in transcendental darkness, till the common daylight of common sense became intolerable to his eyes. He called the sun an ignis fatuus, and exhorted all who would listen to his friendly voice, which were about as many as called God Save King Richard, to shelter themselves from its delusive radiance in the obscure haunt of old philosophy. This word old had great charms for him. The good old times were always on his lips, meaning the days when polemic theology was in its prime, and rival prelates beat the drum ecclesiastic with Herculean vigor, till the one wound up his series of syllogisms with the very orthodox conclusion of roasting the other. But the dearest friend of Mr. Glowry, and his most welcome guest, was Mr. Toobad, the Manichaean millenarian. The 12th verse of the 12th chapter of Revelations was always in his mouth. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come among you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. He maintained that the supreme dominion of the world was, for wise purposes, given over for a while to the evil principle, and that this precise period of time, commonly called the Enlightened Age, was the point of his plenitude of power. He used to add that by and by he would be cast down, and a high and happy order of things succeed, but he never omitted the saving clause, not in our time, which last words were always echoed in doleful response by the sympathetic Mr. Glowry. Another and very frequent visitor was the Reverend Mr. Larynx, the vicar of Claydyke, a village about 10 miles distant, a good-natured, accommodating divine, who was always most obligingly ready to take a dinner and a bed at the house of any country gentleman in distress for a companion. Nothing came amiss to him. A game at billiards, at chess, at draughts, at backgammon, at piquet, or at all fours in a tete-a-tete, or any game on the cards, round, square, or triangular, in a party of any number exceeding 2. He would even dance among friends, rather than that a lady, even if she were on the wrong side of 30, should sit still for want of a partner. For a ride, a walk, or a sail in the morning, a song after dinner, a ghost story after supper, a bottle of port with the squire, or a cup of green tea with his lady, for all or any of these, or for anything else that was agreeable to anyone else, consistently with the dye of his coat, the Reverend Mr. Larynx was at all times equally ready. When at Nightmare Abbey, he would condole with Mr. Glowry, drink Madeira with Scythrop, crack jokes with Mr. Hilary, hand Mrs. Hilary to the piano, take charge of her fan and gloves, and turn over her music with surprising dexterity, quote Revelations with Mr. Toobad, and lament the good old times of feudal darkness with the transcendental Mr. Flosky. End of chapter. Chapter 2. Shortly after the disastrous termination of Scythrop's passion for Miss Emily Girouette, Mr. Glowry found himself, much against his will, involved in a lawsuit which compelled him to dance attendance on the High Court of Chancery. Scythrop was left alone at Nightmare Abbey. He was a burnt child, and dreaded the fire of female eyes. He wandered about the ample pile, or along the garden terrace, with his cogitative faculties immersed in cogibundity of cogitation. The terrace terminated at the southwestern tower, which, as we have said, was ruinous and full of owls. Here would Scythrop take his evening seat, on a fallen fragment of mossy stone, with his back resting against the ruined wall, a thick canopy of ivy with an owl in it over his head, and the Sorrows of Werther in his hand. He had some taste for romance reading before he went to the university, where, we must confess, in justice to his college, he was cured of the love of reading in all its shapes, and the cure would have been radical if disappointment in love and total solitude had not conspired to bring on a relapse. He began to devour romances and German tragedies, and, by the recommendation of Mr. Flosky, to pore over ponderous tomes of transcendental philosophy, which reconciled him to the labor of studying them by their mystical jargon and necromantic imagery. In the congenial solitude of Nightmare Abbey, the distempered ideas of metaphysical romance and romantic metaphysics had ample time and space to germinate into a fertile crop of chimeras, which rapidly shot up into vigorous and abundant vegetation. He now became troubled with the passion for reforming the world. Footnote. The passion for reforming the world. See Forsyth's Principles of Moral Science. He built many castles in the air, and peopled them with secret tribunals and bands of Illuminati, who were always the imaginary instruments of his projected regeneration of the human species. As he intended to institute a perfect republic, he invested himself with absolute sovereignty over these mystical dispensers of liberty. He slept with horrid mysteries under his pillow, and dreamed of venerable Eleutherox and ghastly confederates holding midnight conventions in subterranean caves. He passed whole mornings in his study, immersed in gloomy reverie, stalking about the room in his nightcap, which he pulled over his eyes like a cowl, and folding his striped calico dressing-gown about him like the mantle of a conspirator. Action, thus he soliloquized, is the result of opinion, and to new model opinion would be to new model society. Knowledge is power. It is in the hands of a few, who employ it to mislead the many for their own selfish purposes of aggrandizement and appropriation. What if it were in the hands of a few who should employ it to lead the many? What if it were universal, and the multitude were enlightened? No. The many must be always in leading strings, but let them have wise and honest conductors, a few to think and many to act. That is the only basis of perfect society. So thought the ancient philosophers. They had their esoterical and exoterical doctrines. So thinks the sublime Kant, who delivers his oracles in language which none but the initiated can comprehend. Such were the views of those secret associations of Illuminati, which were the terror of superstition and tyranny, and which, carefully selecting wisdom and genius from the great wilderness of society, as the bee selects honey from the flowers of the thorn and the nettle, bound all human excellence in a chain, which, if it had not been prematurely broken, would have commanded opinion and regenerated the world. Scythrop proceeded to meditate on the practicability of reviving a confederation of regenerators. To get a clear view of his own ideas, and to feel the pulse of the wisdom and genius of the age, he wrote and published a treatise, in which his meanings were carefully wrapped up in the monk's hood of transcendental technology, but filled with hints of matter deep and dangerous, which he thought would set the whole nation in a ferment, and he awaited the result in awful expectation, as a miner who has fired a train awaits the explosion of a rock. However, he listened and heard nothing, for the explosion, if any ensued, was not sufficiently loud to shake a single leaf of the ivy on the towers of Nightmare Abbey. And some months afterwards he received a letter from his bookseller informing him that only 7 copies had been sold, and concluding with a polite request for the balance. Scythrop did not despair. 7 copies, he thought, have been sold. 7 is a mystical number, and the omen is good. Let me find the 7 purchasers of my 7 copies, and they shall be the 7 golden candlesticks with which I will illuminate the world. Scythrop had a certain portion of mechanical genius which his romantic projects tended to develop. He constructed models of cells and recesses, sliding panels and secret passages, that would have baffled the skill of the Parisian police. He took the opportunity of his father's absence to smuggle a dumb carpenter into the abbey, and between them they gave reality to one of these models in Scythrop's tower. Scythrop foresaw that a great leader of human regeneration would be involved in fearful dilemmas, and determined, for the benefit of mankind in general, to adopt all possible precautions for the preservation of himself. The servants, even the women, had been tutored into silence. Profound stillness reigned throughout and around the abbey, except when the occasional shutting of a door would peal in long reverberations through the galleries, or the heavy tread of the pensive butler would wake the hollow echoes of the hall. Scythrop stalked about like the Grand Inquisitor, and the servants flitted past him like familiars. In his evening meditations on the terrace, under the ivy of the ruined tower, the only sounds that came to his ear were the rustling of the wind in the ivy, the plaintive voices of the feathered choristers, the owls, and the occasional striking of the abbey clock, and the monotonous dash of the sea on its low and level shore. In the meantime, he drank Madeira and laid deep schemes for a thorough repair of the crazy fabric of human nature. End of chapter. Chapter 3. Mr. Glowry returned from London with the loss of his lawsuit. Justice was with him, but the law was against him. He found Scythrop in a mood most sympathetically tragic, and they vied with each other in enlivening their cups by lamenting the depravity of this degenerate age, and occasionally interspersing divers grim jokes about graves, worms, and epitaphs. Mr. Glowry's friends, whom we have mentioned in the first chapter, availed themselves of his return to pay him a simultaneous visit. At the same time arrived Scythrop's friend and fellow collegian, the Honourable Mr. Listless. Mr. Glowry had discovered this fashionable young gentleman in London, stretched on the rack of a too-easy chair, and devoured with a gloomy and misanthropical nil curo, and had pressed him so earnestly to take the benefit of the pure country air at Nightmare Abbey, that Mr. Listless, finding it would give him more trouble to refuse than to comply, summoned his French valet, Fatout, and told him he was going to Lincolnshire. On this simple hint, Fatout went to work, and the imperials were packed, and the post-chariot was at the door, without the Honourable Mr. Listless having said or thought another syllable on the subject. Mr. and Mrs. Hilary brought with them an orphan niece, a daughter of Mr. Glowry's youngest sister, who had made a runaway love-match with an Irish officer. The lady's fortune disappeared in the first year. Love, by a natural consequence, disappeared in the second. The Irishman himself, by a still more natural consequence, disappeared in the third. Mr. Glowry had allowed his sister an annuity, and she had lived in retirement with her only daughter, whom, at her death, which had recently happened, she commended to the care of Mrs. Hilary. Miss Marionetta Celestina O'Carroll was a very blooming and accomplished young lady. Being a compound of the allegro vivace of the O'Carrolls and of the andante doloroso of the Glowrys, she exhibited in her own character all the diversities of an April sky. Her hair was light brown, her eyes hazel, and sparkling with a mild but fluctuating light, her features regular, her lips full, and of equal size, and her person surpassingly graceful. She was a proficient in music. Her conversation was sprightly, but always on subjects light in their nature and limited in their interest. For moral sympathies, in any general sense, had no place in her mind. She had some coquetry and more caprice, liking and disliking almost in the same moment, pursuing an object with earnestness while it seemed unattainable, and rejecting it when in her power as not worth the trouble of possession. Whether she was touched with a penchant for her cousin Scythrop, or was merely curious to see what effect the tender passion would have on so outré a person, she had not been 3 days in the Abbey before she threw out all the lures of her beauty and accomplishments to make a prize of his heart. Scythrop proved an easy conquest. The image of Miss Emily Girouette was already sufficiently dimmed by the power of philosophy and the exercise of reason, for to these influences, or to any influence but the true one, are usually ascribed the mental cures performed by the great physician Time. Scythrop's romantic dreams had indeed given him many pure anticipated cognitions of combinations of beauty and intelligence, which, he had some misgivings, were not exactly realized in his cousin Marionetta. But, in spite of these misgivings, he soon became distractedly in love, which, when the young lady clearly perceived, she altered her tactics, and assumed as much coldness and reserve as she had before shown ardent and ingenuous attachment. Scythrop was confounded at the sudden change, but, instead of falling at her feet and requesting an explanation, he retreated to his tower, muffled himself in his nightcap, seated himself in the president's chair of his imaginary secret tribunal, summoned Marionetta with all terrible formalities, frightened her out of her wits, disclosed himself, and clasped the beautiful penitent to his bosom. While he was acting this reverie, in the moment in which the awful president of the secret tribunal was throwing back his cowl and his mantle, and discovering himself to the lovely culprit as her adoring and magnanimous lover, the door of the study opened, and the real Marionetta appeared. The motives which had led her to the tower were a little penitence, a little concern, a little affection, and a little fear as to what the sudden secession of Scythrop, occasioned by her sudden change of manner, might portend. She had tapped several times unheard, and of course unanswered, and at length, timidly and cautiously opening the door, she discovered him standing up before a black velvet chair, which was mounted on an old oak table, in the act of throwing open his striped calico dressing-gown and flinging away his nightcap, which is what the French call an imposing attitude. Each stood a few moments fixed in their respective places, the lady in astonishment, and the gentleman in confusion. Marionetta was the first to break silence. "For heaven's sake," said she, "my dear Scythrop, what is the matter?" "For heaven's sake, indeed!" said Scythrop, springing from the table. "For your sake, Marionetta, and you are my heaven, distraction is the matter. I adore you, Marionetta, and your cruelty drives me mad." He threw himself at her knees, devoured her hand with kisses, and breathed 1,000 vows in the most passionate language of romance. Marionetta listened a long time in silence, till her lover had exhausted his eloquence and paused for a reply. She then said, with a very arch look, "I prithee deliver thyself like a man of this world." The levity of this quotation, and of the manner in which it was delivered, jarred so discordantly on the high-wrought enthusiasm of the romantic Imarato, that he sprang upon his feet and beat his forehead with his clenched fist. The young lady was terrified, and deeming it expedient to soothe him, took one of his hands in hers, placed the other hand on his shoulder, looked up in his face with a winning seriousness, and said, in the tenderest possible tone, "What would you have, Scythrop?" Scythrop was in heaven again. "What would I have? What but you, Marionetta? You for the companion of my studies, the partner of my thoughts, the auxiliary of my great designs for the emancipation of mankind." "I am afraid I should be but a poor auxiliary, Scythrop. What would you have me do?" "Do as Rosalia does with Carlos, divine Marionetta. Let us each open a vein in the other's arm, mix our blood in a bowl, and drink it as a sacrament of love. Then we shall see visions of transcendental illumination, and soar on the wings of ideas into the space of pure intelligence." Marionetta could not reply. She had not so strong a stomach as Rosalia, and turned sick at the proposition. She disengaged herself suddenly from Scythrop, sprang through the door of the tower, and fled with precipitation along the corridors. Scythrop pursued her, crying, "Stop, stop, Marionetta! My life, my love!" and was gaining rapidly on her flight, when, at an ill-omened corner, where two corridors ended in an angle, at the head of a staircase, he came into sudden and violent contact with Mr. Toobad, and they both plunged together to the foot of the stairs, like two billiard balls into one pocket. This gave the young lady time to escape and enclose herself in her chamber, while Mr. Toobad, rising slowly and rubbing his knees and shoulders, said, "You'll see, my dear Scythrop, in this little incident, one of the innumerable proofs of the temporary supremacy of the devil. For what but a systematic design and concurrent contrivance of evil could have made the angles of time and place coincide in our unfortunate persons at the head of this accursed staircase?" "Nothing else, certainly," said Scythrop. "You are perfectly in the right, Mr. Toobad. Evil and mischief and misery and confusion and vanity and vexation of spirit and death and disease and assassination and war and poverty and pestilence and famine and avarice and selfishness and rancor and jealousy and spleen and malevolence and the disappointments of philanthropy and the faithlessness of friendship and the crosses of love, all prove the accuracy of your views and the truth of your system, and it is not impossible that the infernal interruption of this fall downstairs may throw a color of evil on the whole of my future existence." "My dear boy," said Mr. Toobad, "you have a fine eye for consequences." So saying, he embraced Scythrop, who retired with a disconsolate step to dress for dinner, while Mr. Toobad stalked across the hall, repeating, "Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come among you, having great wrath." End of chapter. Chapter 4. The flight of Marionetta and the pursuit of Scythrop had been witnessed by Mr. Glowry, who, in consequence, narrowly observed his son and his niece in the evening, and, concluding from their manner that there was a better understanding between them than he wished to see, he determined on obtaining the next morning from Scythrop a full and satisfactory explanation. He, therefore, shortly after breakfast, entered Scythrop's tower with a very grave face, and said, without ceremony or preface, "So, sir, you are in love with your cousin?" Scythrop, with as little hesitation, answered, "Yes, sir." "That is candid at least, and she is in love with you." "I wish she were, sir." "You know she is, sir." "Indeed, sir, I do not." "But you hope she is." "I do, from my soul." Now that is very provoking, Sithrop, and very disappointing. I could not have supposed that you, Sithrop Glowry of Nightmare Abbey, would have been infatuated with such a dancing, laughing, singing, thoughtless, careless, merry-hearted thing as Marionetta, in all respects the reverse of you and me. It is very disappointing, Sithrop. And do you know, sir, that Marionetta has no fortune? It is the more reason, sir, that her husband should have one. The more reason for her, but not for you. My wife had no fortune, and I had no consolation in my calamity. And do you reflect, sir, what an enormous slice this lawsuit has cut out of our family estate? We who used to be the greatest landed proprietors in Lincolnshire. To be sure, sir, we had more acres of fen than any man on this coast, but what are fens to love? What are dikes and windmills to Marionetta? And what, sir, is love to a windmill? Not grist, I am certain. Besides, sir, I have made a choice for you. I have made a choice for you, Sithrop. Beauty, genius, accomplishments, and a great fortune into the bargain. Such a lovely, serious creature, in a fine state of high dissatisfaction with the world and everything in it. Such a delightful surprise I had prepared for you. Sir, I have pledged my honor to the contract, the honor of the Glowrys of Nightmare Abbey, and now, sir, what is to be done? Indeed, sir, I cannot say. I claim on this occasion that liberty of action which is the conatal prerogative of every rational being. Liberty of action, sir? There is no such thing as liberty of action. We are all slaves and puppets of a blind and unpathetic necessity. Very true, sir, but liberty of action between individuals consists in their being differently influenced or modified by the same universal necessity, so that the results are unconsentaneous, and their respective necessitated volitions clash and fly off in a tangent. Your logic is good, sir, but you are aware, too, that one individual may be a medium of adhibiting to another a mode or form of necessity, which may have more or less influence in the production of consentaneity. And therefore, sir, if you do not comply with my wishes in this instance, you have had your own way in everything else. I shall be under the necessity of disinheriting you, though I shall do it with tears in my eyes. Having said these words, he vanished suddenly in the dread of Sithrop's logic. Mr. Glowry immediately sought Mrs. Hilary, and communicated to her his views on the case in point. Mrs. Hilary, as the phrase is, was as fond of Marionetta as if she had been her own child. But there is always a but on these occasions. She could do nothing for her in the way of fortune, as she had two hopeful sons who were finishing their education at Brazen-Nose, and who would not like to encounter any diminution of their prospects when they should be brought out of the house of mental bondage, i.e., the university, to the land flowing with milk and honey, i.e., the West End of London. Mrs. Hilary hinted to Marionetta that propriety and delicacy and decorum and dignity, etc., etc., etc. Footnote: decorum and dignity, etc., etc., etc. We are not masters of the whole vocabulary. See any novel by any literary lady. End of footnote. Would require them to leave the abbey immediately. Marianetta listened in silent submission, for she knew that her inheritance was passive obedience. But when Sithrop, who had watched the opportunity of Mrs. Hilary's departure, entered, and, without speaking a word, threw himself at her feet in a paroxysm of grief, the young lady, in equal silence and sorrow, threw her arms round his neck and burst into tears. A very tender scene ensued, which the sympathetic susceptibilities of the soft-hearted reader can more accurately imagine than we can delineate. But when Marianetta hinted that she was to leave the abbey immediately, Sithrop snatched from its repository his ancestor's skull, filled it with Madeira, and presenting himself before Mr. Glowry, threatened to drink off the contents if Mr. Glowry did not immediately promise that Marianetta should not be taken from the abbey without her own consent. Mr. Glowry, who took the Madeira to be some deadly brewage, gave the required promise in dismal panic. Sithrop returned to Marianetta with a joyful heart, and drank the Madeira by the way. Mr. Glowry, during his residence in London, had come to an agreement with his friend Mr. Tubad, that a match between Sithrop and Mr. Tubad's daughter would be a very desirable occurrence. She was finishing her education in a German convent, but Mr. Tubad described her as being fully impressed with the truth of his Ahrimanic philosophy. Footnote: Ahrimanes in the Persian mythology is the evil power, the prince of the kingdom of darkness. He is the rival of Oromatzes, the prince of the kingdom of light. These two powers have divided and equal dominion. Sometimes one of the two has a temporary supremacy. According to Mr. Tubad, the present period would be the reign of Ahrimanes. Lord Byron seems to be of the same opinion, by the use he has made of Ahrimanes in Manfred, where the great Alastor of Persia is hailed king of the world by the Nemesis of Greece, in concert with 3 of the Scandinavian Valkyrie, under the name of the Destinies, the astrological spirits of the alchemists of the Middle Ages, an elemental witch transplanted from Denmark to the Alps, and a chorus of Dr. Faustus's devils who come in the last act for a soul. It is difficult to conceive where this heterogeneous mythological company could have originally met, except at a table d'hôte like the 6 kings in Candide. End of footnote. We will resume that sentence by repeating it. She was finishing her education in a German convent, but Mr. Tubad described her as being fully impressed with the truth of his Ahrimanic philosophy, and being altogether as gloomy and Antithalian a young lady as Mr. Glowry himself could desire for the future mistress of Nightmare Abbey. She had a great fortune in her own right, which was not, as we have seen, without its weight in inducing Mr. Glowry to set his heart upon her as his daughter-in-law that was to be. He was therefore very much disturbed by Sithrop's untoward attachment to Marianetta. He condoled on the occasion with Mr. Tubad, who said that he had been too long accustomed to the intermeddling of the devil in all his affairs, to be astonished at this new trace of his cloven claw, but that he hoped to outwit him yet, for he was sure there could be no comparison between his daughter and Marianetta in the mind of any one who had a proper perception of the fact, that, the world being a great theatre of evil, seriousness and solemnity are the characteristics of wisdom, and laughter and merriment make a human being no better than a baboon. Mr. Glowry comforted himself with this view of the subject, and urged Mr. Tubad to expedite his daughter's return from Germany. Mr. Tubad said he was in daily expectation of her arrival in London, and would set off immediately to meet her, that he might lose no time in bringing her to Nightmare Abbey. "Then," he added, "we shall see whether Thalia or Melpomene whether the Allegra or the Penserosa will carry off the symbol of victory." "There can be no doubt," said Mr. Glowry, "which way the scale will incline, or Scythrop is no true scion of the venerable stem of the Glowries." End of chapter. Chapter 5. Marionetta felt secure of Scythrop's heart, and notwithstanding the difficulties that surrounded her, she could not debar herself from the pleasure of tormenting her lover, whom she kept in a perpetual fever. Sometimes she would meet him with the most unqualified affection, sometimes with the most chilling indifference, rousing him to anger by artificial coldness, softening him to love by eloquent tenderness, or inflaming him to jealousy by coquetting with the Honourable Mr. Listless, who seemed, under her magical influence, to burst into sudden life, like the bud of the evening primrose. Sometimes she would sit by the piano, and listen with becoming attention to Scythrop's pathetic remonstrances, but in the most impassioned part of his oratory she would convert all his ideas into a chaos by striking up some rondo allegro and saying, "Is it not pretty?" Scythrop would begin to storm, and she would answer him with "Zitti, zitti, piano, piano, non facciamo confusione," or some similar facezia, till he would start away from her and enclose himself in his tower in an agony of agitation, vowing to renounce her and her whole sex for ever, and returning to her presence at the summons of the billet, which she never failed to send with many expressions of penitence and promises of amendment. Scythrop's schemes for regenerating the world, and detecting his 7 golden candlesticks, went on very slowly in this fever of his spirit. Things proceeded in this train for several days, and Mr. Glowry began to be uneasy at receiving no intelligence from Mr. Toombad, when one evening the latter rushed into the library, where the family and the visitors were assembled, vociferating, "The devil is come among you, having great wrath." He then drew Mr. Glowry aside into another apartment, and after remaining some time together, they re-entered the library with faces of great dismay, but did not condescend to explain to any one the cause of their discomfiture. The next morning, early, Mr. Toombad departed. Mr. Glowry sighed and groaned all day, and said not a word to any one. Scythrop had quarrelled, as usual, with Marionetta, and was enclosed in his tower in a fit of morbid sensibility. Marionetta was comforting herself at the piano with singing the airs of Nina Pazza per Amore, and the Honourable Mr. Listless was listening to the harmony, as he lay supine on the sofa with a book in his hand, into which he peeped at intervals. The Reverend Mr. Larynx approached the sofa and proposed a game at billiards. The Honourable Mr. Listless: "Billiards? Really, I should be very happy, but in my present exhausted state, the exertion is too much for me. I do not know when I have been equal to such an effort." He rang the bell for his valet. Fatout entered. "Fatout, when did I play at billiards last?" Fatout: "The 14 Decembre de last year, monsieur." Fatout bowed and retired. The Honourable Mr. Listless: "So it was. 7 months ago. You see, Mr. Larynx, you see, sir. My nerves, Miss O'Carroll, my nerves are shattered. I have been advised to try Bath. Some of the faculty recommend Cheltenham. I think of trying both, as the seasons don't clash. The season, you know, Mr. Larynx. The season, Miss O'Carroll. The season is everything." Marionetta: And health is something, n'est-ce pas, Mr. Larynx? The Reverend Mr. Larynx. Most assuredly, Miss O'Carroll. For however reasoners may dispute about the summum bonum, none of them will deny that a very good dinner is a very good thing. And what is a good dinner without a good appetite? And whence is a good appetite but from good health? Now Cheltenham, Mr. Listless, is famous for good appetites. The Honourable Mr. Listless. The best piece of logic I ever heard, Mr. Larynx. The very best, I assure you. I have thought very seriously of Cheltenham, very seriously and profoundly. I thought of it, let me see, when did I think of it? He rang again, and Fatout reappeared. Fatout, when did I think of going to Cheltenham, and did not go? Fatout. De juillet 21 de la summer, messieurs. Fatout retired. The Honourable Mr. Listless. So it was. An invaluable fellow that, Mr. Larynx. Invaluable, Miss O'Carroll. Marionetta. So I should judge, indeed. He seems to serve you as a walking memory, and to be a living chronicle, not of your actions only, but of your thoughts. The Honourable Mr. Listless. An excellent definition of the fellow, Miss O'Carroll. Excellent, upon my honour. Ha ha ha! Hi-ho! Laughter is pleasant, but the exertion is too much for me. A parcel was brought in for Mr. Listless. It had been sent express. Fatout was summoned to unpack it, and it proved to contain a new novel and a new poem, both of which had long been anxiously expected by the whole host of fashionable readers, and the last number of a popular review, of which the editor and his coadjutors were in high favour at court, and enjoyed ample pensions for their services to church and state. Footnote: pension, pay given to a slave of state for treason to his country. From Johnson's Dictionary. End of footnote. As Fatout left the room, Mr. Flosky entered and curiously inspected the literary arrivals. Mr. Flosky, turning over the leaves. Devilman, a novel. Hatred, revenge, misanthropy, and quotations from the Bible. This is the morbid anatomy of black bile. Paul Jones, a poem. I see how it is. Paul Jones, an amiable enthusiast, disappointed in his affections, turns pirate from ennui and magnanimity, cuts various masculine throats, wins various feminine hearts. He is hanged at the yardarm. The catastrophe is very awkward and very unpoetical. The Downing Street Review. First article, An Ode to the Red Book by Roderick Sackbut, Esquire. His own poem reviewed by himself. Mr. Flosky proceeded in silence to look over the other articles of the review. Marionetta inspected the novel, and Mr. Listless the poem. The Reverend Mr. Larynx. For a young man of fashion and family, Mr. Listless, you seem to be of a very studious turn. The Honourable Mr. Listless. Studious? You are pleased to be facetious, Mr. Larynx. I hope you do not suspect me of being studious. I have finished my education, but there are some fashionable books that one must read because they are ingredients of the talk of the day. Otherwise, I am no fonder of books than I dare say you yourself are, Mr. Larynx. The Reverend Mr. Larynx. Why, sir, I cannot say that I am indeed particularly fond of books, yet neither can I say that I never do read. A tale or a poem now and then to a circle of ladies over their work is no very heterodox employment of the vocal energy, and I must say, for myself, that few men have a more Job-like endurance of the eternally recurring questions and answers that interweave themselves on these occasions with the crisis of an adventure and heighten the distress of a tragedy. The Honorable Mr. Listless. And very often make the distress when the author has omitted it. Marionetta. I shall try your patience some rainy morning, Mr. Larynx, and Mr. Listless shall recommend us the very new book that everybody reads.